this horrifying haunting. When I was younger, I had a paper route that took me through the quiet, tree-lined streets of our small town. Among the houses I delivered to was one that always stood out, the old, weather-beaten home of Margie Winters. Margie was a frail, elderly woman who lived alone in that creaking, two-story house that seemed to groan with the weight of its own history. Despite her advanced age and solitary existence, Margie was always a bright spot in my day. She had a warmth to her that made her home feel inviting, even though it was filled with old, dusty furniture and the faint scent of mothballs. Her eyes, though clouded with age, still sparkled with life whenever she saw me. I would often take the newspaper inside for her, and we'd chat for a few minutes before I went on my way. It became a routine, something comforting in its predictability. One crisp autumn morning, I approached Margie's house and noticed the curtains were drawn tight, something she rarely did. When I let myself in, as I always did, I found Margie lying in her bed, the covers pulled up to her chin. She appeared to be sleeping, her chest rising and falling softly with each breath. I quietly placed the newspaper on the kitchen table and tiptoed out, not wanting to disturb her rest. The next day, the scene was eerily similar. Margie was still in bed, the newspaper from the previous day untouched, lying exactly where I had left it. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I convinced myself that she was simply sleeping in. She was old, after all. Perhaps she needed the extra rest. I placed the new paper beside the old one and left, feeling an uneasy knot forming in my stomach. On the third day, I hesitated before entering her home. The house seemed unusually quiet, almost as if it was holding its breath. When I entered, Margie was sitting up in bed, a small, tired smile on her face. Relief washed over me. She looked weaker than usual, but her eyes were filled with an unusual brightness. She reached out to me, and I approached her, feeling the strange atmosphere in the room. "Thank you for always being so kind to me," Margie said in a voice that was soft, almost ethereal. She pulled me into a gentle embrace, her frail arms surprisingly warm and comforting. I remember the feeling of her hug so vividly, an odd mix of warmth and coldness, as though she was both there and not there at the same time. When I left her house that day, I felt a lingering sense of unease, though I tried to push it to the back of my mind. The following morning, as I approached Margie's house, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There were several cars, parked outside, all unfamiliar. The front door was ajar, and voices murmured inside. My first thought was that Margie might be having visitors, but as I stepped closer, I overheard snippets of a conversation that froze the blood in my veins. "She must have passed in her sleep. Looks like she's been gone for days." I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. I must have misheard them. I had to have misheard them. But as I slowly entered the house, I saw it. Margie's bed was empty, the sheets drawn back as if she had simply gotten up. But the air was thick with sorrow, and there was an unspoken heaviness that weighed down on everything. One of the visitors, a middle-aged woman who I assumed was a relative, noticed me standing there. She gave me a sad, pitying look. "You must be the boy who delivers her papers," she said gently. "Margie passed away in her sleep 3 or 4 days ago. We just found her this morning." My mind reeled. My thoughts a chaotic swirl of confusion and disbelief. 4 days? How could that be possible? I had seen her just yesterday. She had hugged me, spoken to me. She had been alive, hadn't she? As I stood there in that dim, sorrowful house, the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The Margie I had spoken to, the Margie who had hugged me, had already been dead. Somehow I had interacted with her spirit, her lingering essence, before she finally moved on. I left the house in a daze, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. The warmth of her hug stayed with me for a long time, a chilling reminder of the encounter. To this day, I can still feel the ghostly warmth of her embrace, and I can't help but wonder if, in those final moments, Margie was saying her last goodbyes before passing into the next world. That paper route was never the same after that, and neither was I. This spine-tingling snack. Working the midnight shift at a hospital can be a surreal experience. The usual hustle and bustle of the day gives way to an eerie quiet as the night deepens, and the long, sterile hallways feel endless. The few of us on duty would often joke about how the hospital felt different at night, as if the building itself was awake, watching, waiting. But that was just a way to pass the time until something happened that made those jokes seem far too real. It was a cold, quiet night, the kind where every sound seems amplified, every creak and groan of the old building a little too loud. The clock had just struck 3 a.m., the infamous witching hour, and my stomach rumbled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten in hours. The cafeteria was closed, of course, but there was a vending machine in a small alcove on the lower level. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I made my way down the dimly lit hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The hospital was unsettlingly quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound, the soft hum of machinery, the distant clatter of a cart, the occasional murmur of a patient talking in their sleep. As I approached the vending machine, the familiar whir of the machine greeted me, its glowing display a welcome sight in the darkness. Just to the right of the vending machine was a door with a small window, the glass frosted with age, but still offering a view into the cafeteria beyond. I was focused on selecting a snack, my mind wandering in that hazy state between tiredness and alertness that comes with working overnight. I pressed the button for a bag of chips and waited for the machine to dispense them. As I bent down to retrieve my snack, something caught my eye, a movement in the window. I straightened up and glanced through the glass, and that's when I saw it. A figure moving slowly across the cafeteria, just a vague outline in the darkness. My first thought was that it was one of my colleagues, maybe a security guard making rounds or a nurse grabbing a quick break. But something about the way the figure moved was off. It was almost like they were gliding, not quite walking. I watched, puzzled, as the figure continued to move across the room. Then a cold realization hit me. The cafeteria had motion sensor lights that were supposed to turn on the moment anyone entered, but the lights were still off. The room remained pitch black, save for the dim glow coming through the window from the hallway where I stood. My heart began to race as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I took a hesitant step closer to the door, squinting to get a better look. The figure had reached the far side of the room now, where there should have been a wall. But instead of stopping, they kept moving forward, disappearing into the darkness. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was more tired than I realized. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was no door or passage where the figure had been heading, just a solid wall. A sense of dread washed over me as I stood frozen in place, staring at the now empty cafeteria. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, an instinctive reaction to the overwhelming feeling that I was not alone. My hands started to tremble, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But curiosity is a strange thing. Despite the terror creeping up my spine, I found myself reaching for the door handle, my mind desperate for an explanation. Maybe I just imagined it, or maybe there was some logical reason for what I'd seen. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking ominously as the door swung inward. The cafeteria was as dark as ever, the only light coming from the small window behind me. I stepped inside, half expecting the motion sensors to finally activate, but the room remained shrouded in darkness. I took a few steps forward, my feet echoing on the cold tile floor. The air was thick and heavy, and the silence was oppressive. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I reached the spot where I had seen the figure disappear, my heart in my throat. I hesitated, staring at the blank wall in front of me. There was nothing there. No door, no passage, nothing but cold, unyielding concrete. My rational mind fought to take control, but the fear was overwhelming, a primal terror that I couldn't shake. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A faint rustling, like the sound of fabric brushing against something, or the whisper of a breath. It was so quiet that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But I knew better. I wasn't alone. Panic set in, and I turned and ran. I sprinted out of the cafeteria, through the door, and down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the brightly lit main floor. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere, anywhere else. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I avoided that lower level for weeks, making sure I was never alone when I had to go down there. I never told anyone what happened, afraid they would dismiss it as a hallucination or a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But I knew what I had seen. And every time I walked by that vending machine, I couldn't help but glance at that door, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing there, watching me. This nurturing spirit. My mom often tells a story from when I was just a baby, one that still gives her chills to this day. It happened during a time when our family lived in an old creaky house on the outskirts of town, a house that had seen many generations come and go. The house had a certain charm to it, with its worn wooden floors and drafty windows, but there was also something about it that always felt different. The kind of different that makes you feel like you're never truly alone, even when you are. It was a cold winter night, and the wind outside howled like a restless spirit, rattling the windows and making the house seem even more isolated. My mom had put me down in my crib hours earlier, but I was having one of those nights. Fussy, restless, unable to settle down. She was exhausted, having already been up with me several times, trying to soothe me back to sleep. Each time, she would gently rock me, whispering lullabies until my cries subsided, only for them to start up again as soon as she left the room. By the time it was past midnight, she was running on empty, barely able to keep her eyes open. Still, when I started crying again, she dragged herself out of bed, determined to comfort me. But as she was about to step out of her room, something happened that stopped her in her tracks. She heard footsteps. They were soft, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. The sound of someone walking down the hallway directly toward my room. Her heart skipped a beat and a wave of fear washed over her. We lived alone at the time, just the two of us, so there was no one else who could have been making those sounds. Panic set in. Her first thought was that someone had broken in, and her instincts told her to protect her baby. But she was frozen, every muscle tense, listening intently as the footsteps grew closer. She tried to convince herself that it was just her tired mind playing tricks, but the creaking of the floorboards was too real, too deliberate. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. Silence filled the house, thick and oppressive. My mom held her breath, her ears straining to catch any sound, any clue as to what was happening. And then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic creaking, the unmistakable sound of my crib being rocked. Her blood ran cold. She knew she hadn't touched the crib since she had put me down earlier. Who or what was in the room with me? And then, amidst the eerie silence, another sound reached her ears, one that both terrified and bewildered her. A voice, gentle, soothing, and unmistakably that of an older woman. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but she could make out the tone, the cadence of someone speaking softly to a child, trying to calm it. My mom's mind raced. There was no one else in the house, no one who could possibly be in my room with me. But the voice was there, undeniable, speaking to me as if I was its own. Her fear was almost overwhelming, but there was also something else, a strange, inexplicable sense of peace. Whoever or whatever was in that room wasn't there to harm us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my mom mustered the courage to move. She slowly, cautiously crept down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the doorway to my room, she held her breath, terrified of what she might see. But when she peered inside, there was nothing. No intruder, no stranger standing over my crib. Just me, lying there peacefully, no longer crying, my tiny chest rising and falling in the calm rhythm of sleep. The crib was still gently rocking, as if someone had just left it. My mom stood there in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty, but the air was thick with an energy she couldn't explain. It was as if someone had been there, comforting me in a way she hadn't been able to. She wanted to believe it was just her imagination, that she was simply overtired and hearing things, but the lingering warmth in the room told her otherwise. For the rest of the night, she stayed by my crib, unable to shake the feeling that we had been visited by something or someone beyond the ordinary. She never spoke of it again for years, not wanting to seem crazy, but the experience stayed with her, etched into her memory like a vivid dream. It wasn't until much later, when she confided in an elderly neighbor, that she learned something that made her hair stand on end. The neighbor mentioned that the house had once belonged to a woman named Evelyn, who had lived there for decades, raising her children and eventually passing away peacefully in her sleep. She had been known for her kindness, especially toward children, and had often taken care of the neighborhood kids as if they were her own. My mom couldn't help but wonder if it had been Evelyn's spirit that had come to soothe me that night, stepping in when my mom was too exhausted to comfort me herself. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Whoever that spirit was, they had shown a kindness that transcended the boundaries between life and death. To this day, my mom swears that on that cold winter night, something or someone had been watching over me, cradling me with a nurturing presence that could only have come from the other side. And while the experience was undeniably eerie, there was a sense of gratitude too. Gratitude that in that old house, we weren't truly alone, and that some spirits, even in death, continue to care for those they once loved. This foreboding conversation. In the final week of my grandmother's life, a peculiar and unsettling change came over her. She began spending long hours in silence, staring off into the distance, her eyes fixed on something or someone that none of us could see. At first, we dismissed it as the disorientation that sometimes comes with age and illness. But as the days went on, her behavior became harder to ignore, and a chill began to settle over the household. It wasn't just the vacant stares, it was the conversations. She would speak softly, her voice barely more than a whisper, as if she were talking to someone who was right there in the room with her. At first, we assumed she was simply reminiscing, her mind drifting back to memories of her youth. But then, we started to recognize the names she was saying, names of people who had long since passed away. The first time we noticed, she was speaking to her sister, Rose. Rose had been gone for nearly a decade, taken by a sudden illness that had left a deep scar on our family. As we listened from the doorway, my grandmother's voice was calm, almost serene. "Okay, Rose," she said, a faint smile on her lips. "I'll be there soon." The way she spoke, it was as if she were making plans to visit Rose, as if they were arranging a meeting in the near future. We exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to make of it. The idea that my grandmother might be communing with the dead was too strange, too frightening to fully accept, but it continued. Over the next few days, she spoke to others as well. Our Uncle Joe, her childhood friend Elsie, her own mother, all of whom had been gone for many years. The conversations followed a pattern. She would sit quietly for a while, her eyes distant. Then she would start talking, responding to some unheard question or comment. Each time, she spoke with a sense of peace, as if the presence of these long-dead loved ones brought her comfort rather than fear. We tried to comfort ourselves with the thought that maybe in some way they were helping her transition, easing her into whatever comes after this life. But then something happened that none of us were prepared for. One evening, as we gathered in the living room, we heard her voice again. This time, she wasn't speaking to Rose or Joe or any of the others we'd come to expect. "Henry," she said, her tone soft but clear, "I'll see you soon." Henry was her younger brother, and as far as we knew, he was still very much alive. He lived several states away, and although they hadn't seen each other in a few years, they had always been close. The mention of his name sent a ripple of unease through the room. We didn't know what to think. Was it just another memory surfacing in her fragile state, or was it something more ominous? We tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just confused, her mind playing tricks on her as it wandered between the past and the present. But deep down, we felt an inexplicable dread. There was something about the way she said his name, something that made the hairs on the back of our necks stand on end. That night, as we gathered around the dinner table, the conversation inevitably turned to Henry. We debated whether we should call him, just to check in, but we decided against it. After all, what could we say? "Grandma thinks you're dead." It sounded ridiculous. Instead, we tried to push it from our minds, telling ourselves that it was just another odd moment in an already strange and difficult time. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of our thoughts. We couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, as we were going about our usual routines, the phone rang. My mother answered it, and the color drained from her face almost immediately. She listened in stunned silence, her knuckles white as she gripped the receiver. When she finally hung up, her eyes were wide with shock. "Henry's gone," she said, her voice trembling. "He died this morning." A cold silence fell over the room. None of us knew what to say. It was as if the air had been sucked out this act, leaving us all breathless, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The timing was too precise, too eerie to be a coincidence. Henry had died at almost the exact moment that our grandmother had spoken his name. We tried to make sense of it, but there was no explanation that could satisfy the gnawing feeling in our stomachs. How could she have known? How could she have been speaking to him, just as she had been speaking to the others who had already crossed over? It was as if she had some connection to the other side, a link that allowed her to sense things that the rest of us couldn't. For the remainder of her days, my grandmother continued her quiet conversations, speaking to those who had gone before her, as if she were preparing for a journey of her own. And when she finally passed away, just a few days later, it was with a peaceful expression on her face, as if she were simply slipping away to join them. We never spoke much about what had happened in those final days, but the memory of it stayed with us, a lingering reminder that there are mysteries in this world that we may never fully understand. My grandmother's foreboding conversation with her brother was more than just a strange coincidence. It was a glimpse into something beyond our comprehension, a connection to a realm where life and death intertwine in ways that defy explanation. Even now, years later, when I think back on those days, I can't shake the feeling that in her final moments, my grandmother wasn't alone. She was surrounded by those who had loved her in life and who were waiting to welcome her into whatever lies beyond. And in that brief, unsettling moment, we were witnesses to the thin veil between this world and the next, drawn aside just long enough for us to catch a fleeting glimpse of the unknown. The Vanishing Nurse. When I was about 6 years old, something happened that I still can't fully explain. My mom worked as a nurse, a demanding job that often meant long hours and late nights. Her closest coworker, a woman named Janet, was practically like family. My mom often talked about her, and though I'd never met Janet in person, I knew she was someone my mom admired deeply. One day, the news came that Janet had passed away unexpectedly. I remember the heavy atmosphere in the house that evening. My mom was heartbroken, and the grief seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Even at my young age, I could sense the weight of it all. I didn't fully understand death, but I knew that someone very important to my mom was gone, and that loss was palpable. That night, something woke me from sleep. I found myself in my mom's bed, which wasn't unusual. I often crawled into her bed when I was scared or just wanted to be close to her. But this time, something was different. The room felt strange, like there was a presence there that shouldn't be. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off the sleepiness, and then I saw her. There, standing over my mom, was a woman. She was tall, with a gentle face and a calm demeanor. She wore a nurse's uniform, just like the ones my mom and her colleagues wore. In her hand, she held what looked like an IV needle. She was leaning over my mom as if she were about to start an IV, or maybe just checking on her, as a nurse might do with a patient. My heart pounded in my chest, but I wasn't scared. Not exactly. The woman didn't seem threatening at all. In fact, there was something comforting about her presence, like she was there to take care of my mom. Her movements were slow and deliberate, and there was a kindness in the way she looked down at my mother, who was fast asleep and completely unaware of what was happening. The strange part, though, was that I had never seen this woman before. She wasn't one of my mom's friends or anyone who had ever visited our house, but somehow she seemed familiar in a way that I couldn't quite place. As I lay there, frozen in place, she suddenly looked up and noticed me watching her. Our eyes met, and she smiled, a warm, gentle smile that seemed to radiate a sense of peace. There was no malice in her expression, only a serene kindness that made me feel safe, even in that strange, surreal moment. I didn't know what to do, so I just stared back at her, unable to move or speak. After what felt like an eternity, the woman straightened up, still smiling, and then she turned and walked out of the room. I watched her as she moved down the hallway, her steps silent on the carpet. There was something ethereal about the way she walked, almost like she was gliding rather than walking. As she reached the end of the hallway, she simply vanished, disappearing into the shadows without a sound. I lay there for a long time, too stunned to move. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell back to sleep, though the image of the woman stayed with me. When I woke up the next morning, I wasn't sure if what I had seen was real or just a dream. But the vividness of it all, the way she looked, the way she smiled at me, it felt too real to be just my imagination. A few days later, my mom returned home from Janet's funeral. She was still deeply saddened by the loss, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. I hesitated to tell her about what I had seen, afraid she might think I was making it up or that it would upset her even more. But curiosity got the better of me, and I finally asked her about Janet. "Mom, what did Janet look like?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. My mom paused, then went to a drawer and pulled out a small photo album. She flipped through the pages until she found a picture of Janet, one taken at some hospital event or holiday party. She handed the album to me, and when I looked at the photo, my breath caught in my throat. It was her. The woman who had stood over my mom's bed, the one who had smiled at me before vanishing into the night. It was Janet. I stared at the picture, my mind racing. How could it be her? I had never met Janet in person, never seen her face before that night. Yet, somehow, I had recognized her immediately when I saw the photo. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. I looked up at my mom, who was watching me with a curious expression. I wasn't sure how to explain what I had seen, how to tell her that her beloved friend had visited us after she had already passed away. But something inside me knew that Janet had come to check on my mom one last time, to offer comfort and care even from beyond the grave. In the years since, I've thought about that night many times. I've tried to rationalize it, to come up with explanations that make sense, but no matter how I look at it, I can't shake the feeling that Janet's spirit had been there in our house, watching over my mom in her time of grief. It's a memory that remains as clear today as it was then, a reminder that sometimes the bonds we share with others are strong enough to transcend even death. And every time I think about it, I can't help but feel a strange mix of emotions: fear, wonder, and a deep, inexplicable comfort, knowing that in those final moments, Janet had come back, if only for a brief moment, to take care of the friend she had loved so dearly. This hash-slinging slasher. Working the overnight shift at McDonald's wasn't exactly glamorous, but it had its perks. The place was usually quiet, with only the occasional late-night customer wandering in for a quick bite. The rest of the time, it was just me and two of my coworkers, trying to keep ourselves entertained while washing dishes, cleaning the kitchen, and counting down the hours until our shift ended. On one of those nights, the three of us were in the back, scrubbing down the last of the dishes. The restaurant was completely empty, and the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft tunes coming from the stereo we kept on the front counter. That old stereo was our saving grace during those long shifts, breaking the monotony with a mix of random radio stations and static. It was just another routine night, or so we thought. The stereo, perched safely on the counter where it always was, suddenly became the center of something truly bizarre. As we worked in the back, there was a loud crash that echoed through the empty restaurant. Startled, we all stopped what we were doing and exchanged confused looks. The sound had come from the front, near the counter, where no one had been for the past hour. We cautiously made our way to the front of the store, half expecting to find that a stack of trays had toppled over or that maybe some piece of equipment had malfunctioned. But what we saw instead made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The stereo, the same one that had been playing music just moments before, was lying on the floor, completely unplugged from the outlet. The cord was neatly coiled next to it, as if someone had deliberately pulled it from the wall and set it down. But there was no one else in the restaurant. We were alone, and the front door was still securely locked. The stereo had been sitting perfectly level on the counter, a spot it had occupied for months without incident. There was no reason for it to have fallen, let alone unplugged itself in the process. My coworker, a skeptical guy who didn't believe in anything supernatural, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just vibrations from the dishwashers. he suggested, though his voice wavered with doubt. But we all knew that was impossible. The stereo had been sitting far from any machinery, and the counter was solid and stable. There was no logical explanation for what had just happened. Determined to get to the bottom of it, we checked the security tapes. The cameras had a clear view of the front counter, and we rewound the footage to the exact moment of the crash. What we saw on that screen was something straight out of a horror movie. There was the stereo, sitting quietly on the counter, exactly as we had left it. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, out of nowhere, the stereo jerked forward as if an invisible hand had grabbed it and flung it off the counter with force. It didn't just tip over or slide. It literally flew off, landing on the floor with a heavy thud. We all stared at the screen in stunned silence, replaying the footage over and over again, hoping to catch some logical explanation, maybe a shadow or a reflection that could account for what we'd seen. But there was nothing. No one was there, and nothing visible had caused the stereo to move. It had just moved. On its own, or with help from something unseen. The realization hit us all at once, and a cold chill ran down my spine. The only explanation that made any sense, as much as I didn't want to believe it, was that some kind of ghost or spirit was responsible. We had heard stories of other fast food joints being haunted, tales of eerie happenings during the graveyard shift, but we had always laughed them off as just that, stories. But now, faced with undeniable evidence, we couldn't laugh it off anymore. For the rest of the night, we stayed together, too freaked out to be alone in any part of the restaurant. The stereo stayed on the floor, and none of us dared to touch it. We tried to get back to work, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Every little noise made us jump. Every creak of the building made our hearts race. The minutes seemed to drag on forever, and the once comforting hum of the fluorescent lights now seemed ominous. When our shift finally ended, we practically ran out of the building, leaving the stereo where it lay. None of us talked much about what had happened after that night. We all just wanted to forget it, to pretend it had never happened. But deep down, I knew that we had experienced something we couldn't explain, something that defied all logic and reason. Even now, years later, I can't walk past a McDonald's without thinking about that night. The memory is burned into my mind, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. I still don't have an explanation for it, and maybe I never will. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the night I came face to face with the unexplained, right there in the place I least expected it. This final goodbye. It was a quiet night, the kind of stillness that only seems to exist in the early hours of the morning when the world is asleep. I was lying in bed, unable to drift off, my mind swirling with thoughts I couldn't quite grasp. The soft glow of the alarm clock beside me read 2 a.m., and I could hear nothing but the faint hum of the night outside. My room was a familiar comfort, the blankets warm and the pillow perfectly molded to my head. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no reason for the unease that kept me awake. But then, as I lay there staring at the ceiling, something happened that I'll never forget. I felt a firm but gentle touch on my leg, like the reassuring hand of someone you trust deeply. It wasn't a fleeting sensation. It lingered just long enough for me to be certain it was real. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickly looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing beside my bed. But there was no one, just me, alone in the dim light of my room. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I knew that no one else was in the room, and the door was firmly shut. My rational mind wanted to dismiss it as a figment of my imagination, a trick played by my tired brain. But the sensation had been too clear, too deliberate to be merely a figment of my imagination. It felt like someone had reached out to me, not in a threatening way, but with a touch that carried an undeniable sense of purpose. Despite the unease that gripped me, I eventually managed to calm myself down. I convinced myself that maybe it was just a muscle spasm or a strange quirk of my nerves. Exhaustion finally took over, and I drifted off to sleep, though the touch lingered in the back of my mind like a whisper in the dark. The next morning, the sun streamed through my window, washing away the shadows of the night. I had almost forgotten about the strange occurrence when the phone rang. I heard my mother answer it in the other room, her voice quiet and strained. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but I could tell something was wrong. A few moments later, she walked into my room, her face pale and her eyes filled with a sorrow I'd never seen before. She sat down beside me on the bed, took a deep breath, and gently broke the news. My grandmother had passed away in the early hours of the morning, right around 2 a.m. The words hit me like a wave, the reality of it sinking in slowly, painfully. My grandmother and I had always shared a close bond, and the thought of never seeing her again left a deep ache in my chest. As I sat there, processing the news, my mind flashed back to the previous night, to that touch on my leg. The timing was too precise, too uncanny to be a coincidence. My grandmother had always been a nurturing presence in my life, the kind of person who would go out of her way to make sure I was okay, even in her final moments. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that the touch I had felt was her. A final goodbye. A way of letting me know that she was at peace, and that I shouldn't worry. The thought brought me a strange sense of comfort, even in the midst of my grief. I had always believed that when people pass away, they leave behind a part of themselves with the ones they love. But this experience made that belief tangible. It was as if my grandmother had reached out across the veil between life and death to offer me one last moment of reassurance, to let me know that she was watching over me, even as she moved on to whatever lay beyond. In the days that followed, as we made arrangements and mourned her passing, I held on to that moment like a precious gift. Whenever the pain of her loss felt too overwhelming, I would remember that touch on my leg and feel a sense of peace wash over me. It was as if my grandmother had left behind a piece of her spirit with me, a reminder that love doesn't end with death, it transcends it. Even now, years later, I still think about that night whenever I miss her. It's a memory that has stayed with me, offering comfort in moments of sorrow. I've told the story to a few close friends and family members, and while some have tried to offer logical explanations, I know in my heart what it was. It was my grandmother saying goodbye in the only way she could, letting me know that she would always be with me, even if I couldn't see her. Her touch was more than just a sensation, it was a message, one that I carry with me every day. It's a reminder that those we love never truly leave us, that their presence lingers in the quiet moments, in the gentle breeze, in the warmth of a memory. And whenever I feel that familiar ache of missing her, I think back to that night, to that final goodbye, and I find solace in knowing that she's still with me, in her own way. I used to work at a public pool, a job that seemed simple enough, cleaning up after the crowds left, ensuring everything was ready for the next day. It was an old building, the kind that creaked and groaned with age, but I never minded it much. The echo of laughter, splashing water, and the scent of chlorine lingered in the air long after closing time. It was a quiet place at night, and I found a certain peace in the solitude, going about my tasks with the rhythmic hum of the cleaning machines as my only company. One night, I had stayed later than usual, caught up in my routine of scrubbing down the locker rooms and tidying up the pool deck. It was around 2 a.m., and the pool had been closed for hours. The world outside was pitch black, and the only light came from the dim overhead bulbs that lined the pool area, casting long, eerie shadows across the still water. As I moved from the locker rooms back toward the main pool area, I suddenly heard something that made me stop in my tracks. A child's laughter, bright and cheerful, echoing through the cavernous space. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The kind of late-night auditory hallucination that happens when you're tired and your mind starts playing tricks on you. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of small, bare feet pattering across the wet pool deck. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine. I knew there shouldn't be anyone else here. I was certain that I had locked all the doors after the last swimmer left, and the security system had been armed. No one could have gotten in, and yet the laughter continued, light and carefree, as if a child was playing some kind of game just out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I cautiously stepped out onto the pool deck, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The pool itself was perfectly still, the water calm and undisturbed, The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft drip of water from the ceiling. But the laughter had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost oppressive. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the pool, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was no one there. The doors leading outside were all closed and locked, just as I had left them. There were no wet footprints on the tiles, no sign that anyone had been there at all. It was as if the sounds I had heard were nothing more than a figment of my imagination, but I knew better. It had been too real, too vivid to be a trick of the mind. Feeling a growing sense of unease, I headed back to the locker rooms, my steps quickening as I passed by the security monitors. I paused for a moment, glancing at the screens to see if they had picked up anything unusual, but they were blank, showing only the empty pool area and the deserted hallways. It was as if the laughter and the footsteps had never existed, but the sense of being watched lingered. I could feel eyes on me, unseen but unmistakable, as if something or someone was observing me from the shadows. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just my nerves getting the better of me, but the feeling was too strong to ignore. I quickly finished my tasks, eager to leave the building behind and escape into the safety of the night. As I locked the pool for the final time that night, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see a small figure standing there, watching me with innocent, playful eyes. But the pool area was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the emergency lights, and the only sound was the gentle hum of the filtration system. I hurried out of the building, the cool night air a welcome relief as I stepped outside. But the experience stayed with me, nagging at the back of my mind. The next day, I mentioned it to a few of my coworkers, expecting them to laugh it off or tell me I was crazy. But instead, they exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them, an older employee who had been there for years, finally spoke up. "You're not the first to hear that," he said quietly, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "There have been stories about a child who drowned in the pool years ago, late at night. People say they've heard laughter, footsteps, even seen wet footprints leading nowhere. But when they check, there's nothing there." A cold chill ran through me as I listened to his words. I had never heard anything about a child drowning at the pool, but the thought of it made my stomach turn. I couldn't help but wonder if what I had experienced was some kind of echo from the past, a lingering spirit unable to move on, replaying the last moments of its life in an endless loop. From that night on, I never stayed late at the pool alone again. The quiet solitude that I once found comforting had turned into something far more sinister, the shadows seeming to stretch longer, the silence heavier. Even during the day, when the pool was filled with the noise and laughter of swimmers, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting, in the corners of the building. I eventually left the job, unable to bear the unsettling atmosphere any longer. But the memory of that night has stayed with me, a reminder that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. And every so often, when I find myself alone in a quiet place, I hear that faint, ghostly laughter echoing in my mind, and I wonder if the child is still there, waiting for someone to play with in the darkened halls of the pool. This Holy Spirit. One night, deep into the silence that only comes when the world is asleep, I was startled awake. At first, I wasn't sure why I had woken up so suddenly. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. Everything seemed normal, the quiet hum of the night wrapping around me like a blanket. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something that made my heart pound in my chest. Standing next to my bed was a figure, tall, slender, and draped in what looked like a long, flowing habit. It was a nun, her face pale and her expression grave. She was moving her hands rapidly, but her movements weren't erratic or random. They were deliberate, filled with purpose. I watched, frozen in place, as she made the sign of the cross over and over again, her lips moving in what I could only assume were frantic prayers. Despite the terror that gripped me, I couldn't hear her voice. The room was eerily silent, her prayers inaudible as if they were being spoken in another realm entirely. But her presence was unmistakable, as was the urgency in her gestures. She seemed desperate, almost pleading, as she continued to pray fervently, her eyes closed tight as if she were trying to protect me from some unseen danger or beseeching a higher power for help. I lay there, paralyzed by fear, unable to move or speak. My mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why was she here? Was I dreaming? But the vividness of the scene, the cold sweat on my skin, and the pounding of my heart assured me that I was wide awake. The sight of her, so out of place in my modern bedroom, was unsettling beyond words. It felt as though I had been transported back in time, to a place where this nun's presence was not only natural, but necessary. For what felt like an eternity, I watched as she continued her silent prayers, her fingers tracing the sign of the cross again and again with increasing speed and intensity. There was something so sorrowful in the way she moved, as if she was carrying a burden too heavy to bear, a grief too deep to express. And yet, despite the terror that gripped me, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though she was there to protect me, to shield me from something I couldn't see. Eventually her form began to blur, fading into the shadows of the room until she was gone entirely. The air felt lighter, as if whatever weight had been pressing down on the room had lifted. I was left lying in the dark, trembling and drenched in sweat, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The next morning, still shaken, I told my mom about the strange and terrifying encounter. I expected her to brush it off as a bad dream or an overactive imagination, but instead, her face grew pale, and she listened intently, her eyes widening with each detail I shared. When I finished, she hesitated for a moment before telling me something that sent a new wave of chills down my spine. Our house, she began slowly, as if carefully choosing her words, was originally built for a priest many years ago. And back then, nuns would often stay here, helping with the church and taking care of the grounds. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I had known that our house was old, that it had a history, but I had never thought much about who might have lived there before us. The idea that a nun might have once walked the very halls of our home, praying in the rooms where we now slept, was unsettling in a way that I couldn't quite describe. Was the nun I saw a ghost, a lingering spirit bound to the place where she had once lived and prayed? Or was it something else, something more divine? Had she come to warn me, to protect me, or was she simply replaying a moment from her past, unaware of the world around her? These questions haunted me for days, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize the experience, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been touched by something otherworldly. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn to the history of our house, digging through old records and asking neighbors about its past. The more I learned, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The house had indeed been a place of refuge for nuns, a sanctuary where they lived and worked, serving the local parish. Some of them had even passed away within its walls, their lives dedicated to faith and service. I couldn't help but wonder if the nun I saw was one of them, her spirit unable to leave the place where she had spent so many years. Or perhaps she had been drawn back by some connection to me, some reason that I could never fully understand. Whatever the case, the experience left a lasting impression on me, a reminder that the past is never truly gone and that the walls around us hold more than just memories. They hold the echoes of those who came before us, their lives and prayers woven into the fabric of our present. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, half expecting to see that spectral figure standing by my bed, her hands moving in silent prayer. And though the fear still lingers, there's also a sense of comfort, a belief that whatever force guided her to me that night was one of protection, of faith, and of an enduring connection that transcends time and space. As a mortician, I've grown accustomed to the eerie silence and the weight of grief that hangs in the air like a heavy mist. Death is a constant companion in my line of work, and over time, I've learned to compartmentalize the sadness, to focus on the task at hand rather than the emotional toll. But there was one experience that shook me to my core, one that made me question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the veil that separates the two. It was a dreary, overcast afternoon when the call came in. A young child had passed away suddenly, and the family requested an immediate viewing. The loss of a child is always the hardest. There's an innocence to their stillness, a life cut tragically short, and it adds an extra layer of sorrow to the already somber atmosphere. I prepared myself mentally for the task, knowing that this would be one of those days that would linger in my thoughts long after I left the funeral home. The preparation room was cold, as it often is, with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the low hum of machinery filling the air. I went about my work with the practiced precision that comes from years of experience, carefully preparing the child's body for the viewing. The room was bathed in the harsh fluorescent light that seemed to drain the warmth from everything it touched, casting long shadows on the walls. As I worked, I felt an unexpected tug on my hair. It wasn't a gentle brush, like a stray lock caught in the wind, but a deliberate pull, as if someone was playfully trying to get my attention. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively turned around, expecting to see a colleague standing behind me. But there was no one. The room was empty, just as it had been when I started. I shook it off, attributing the sensation to stress or fatigue, and continued with my work, trying to push the unsettling feeling to the back of my mind. A few minutes later, just as I was starting to regain my focus, I heard it. A soft, childlike giggle. The sound was so out of place in the cold clinical environment that it sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the kind of laughter you hear echoing down a hallway or muffled through a door. No, it was close, impossibly close, as if the child was standing right next to me. My hands froze, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the room, but again, there was no one there. The realization that I was completely alone in that room, with no one else around to explain the giggle, sent a wave of unease washing over me. As if on cue, the door to the preparation room suddenly slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the room and causing my heart to race. The machinery around me, which had been humming steadily just moments before, fell silent. The stillness was so complete, so absolute, that it felt as though time itself had paused. The only sound was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears, each beat a reminder of the surreal situation I found myself in. For a moment, I stood there, paralyzed by fear, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The rational part of me wanted to believe that it was all just a series of strange coincidences, a faulty door, a power surge, an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew that what I was experiencing was something far beyond the realm of the ordinary. With a trembling hand, I forced myself to finish the task at hand, my movements stiff and mechanical, as I dressed the child's body with the care and respect they deserved. Despite the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind, I was determined to complete the job, to provide the family with a final moment of peace in the midst of their grief. As I placed the last piece of clothing on the child and stepped back, I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. It was light, almost reassuring, as if someone was trying to comfort me, to let me know that everything was okay. I turned around slowly, my breath hitching in anticipation, but once again, there was no one there. But what happened next is what truly haunts me to this day. I felt a warmth spread around my midsection, enveloping me like a gentle embrace. It was a warmth that defied the cold sterility of the room, a sensation that was so out of place that it made my heart ache. The warmth was centered low on my side, just about where a small child would stand if they were hugging you. It lingered there for a moment, as if offering a final goodbye, before fading away, leaving me standing in the stillness of the room, utterly shaken. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind struggling to process what I had just experienced. There was no rational explanation for what had happened, no draft to explain the tug on my hair, no malfunction to account for the silence of the machines, no one else in the building who could have been responsible for the giggle or the tap on my shoulder. And yet, every detail of the encounter was seared into my memory, vivid and unshakable. When I finally left the preparation room, my hands still trembling and my mind reeling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been visited by the spirit of the child I had just prepared. It was as if they had come to say one final farewell, to leave a lasting impression on the person who had cared for them in their final moments. The warmth of that embrace, the tenderness of that touch, was something I would carry with me long after I left the funeral home that day. In the years since, I've encountered my share of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, flickering lights, the odd cold spot. but nothing has ever come close to the intensity of that experience. It was a reminder that in my line of work, death is not always the end. Sometimes there are things that linger, echoes of the lives that once were, reaching out across the veil to remind us that they are still there, still watching, still remembering. And in those moments, I find a strange comfort in knowing that even in death, we are not truly alone. This woman in white. It was one of those restless nights when sleep eludes you and your mind wanders through a labyrinth of thoughts and worries. I was in the middle of one such night when nature called, and I found myself reluctantly getting out of bed. With my phone in hand, the only source of light in the dim hallway, I shuffled down the corridor toward the bathroom, texting absent-mindedly as I went. My phone's screen illuminated the space just enough to navigate my way, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and dance along the walls. As I made my way down the hallway, absorbed in my text messages, I suddenly collided with something, or rather, someone. I barely registered the impact before I mumbled an apologetic sorry and continued on my way. I didn't look up. My focus was entirely on the screen of my phone. The contact had been brief, almost like bumping into a light post or an unexpected object in your path. I assumed it was just another person from my bustling high school, perhaps a friend who had come over for some late-night study session or visit. It wasn't until I reached the bathroom, closing the door behind me and the light casting its warm glow across the small space, that a realization began to settle in. I was home alone. My house was silent, save for the distant hum of appliances and the occasional creak of settling wood. The absence of my family members and the peaceful stillness of the house had been my normalcy for the evening. The notion that someone had been in my path, especially in the middle of the night, was suddenly unsettling. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, I finished my business and went back to bed, trying to convince myself that the encounter was nothing more than a trick of the mind, a product of fatigue and an overactive imagination. The rest of the night passed in restless sleep, filled with vague dreams and fleeting shadows. The following day, I was woken by the sound of my phone buzzing. My boyfriend was on his way to pick me up for our movie date. I quickly got ready, eager to shake off the eerie remnants of the night before. When I opened the front door to greet him, he looked at me with a puzzled expression and asked, "Why were you staring at me through the upstairs window last night?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tinged with confusion. He continued, "I saw you up there when I pulled up to the house. You were in a white dress, and you seemed to be watching me. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time." My heart skipped a beat. I don't own a white dress. My wardrobe is filled with various colors and styles, but white isn't one of them. The only time I've ever worn white is on rare occasions like weddings or special events, and certainly not late at night standing by a window. I tried to laugh off the comment, attributing it to a misinterpretation or a figment of his imagination. But the uneasy feeling from last night had returned. I began to replay the encounter in my mind, each detail feeling more vivid and unsettling with each recollection. The figure I had bumped into was dressed in white, just like the figure he had seen at the window. The coincidence was too eerie to ignore. Was it possible that the figure I had bumped into was somehow connected to what my boyfriend had seen? The thought of a ghostly presence lingering in my home, one that could appear as a spectral figure in white, was both terrifying and fascinating. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the encounter than mere chance or coincidence. Later that day, I searched through old family photos and any records I could find about the house. I wanted to see if there were any connections to someone who might have had a significant presence in the home, someone who might have worn a white dress. My search turned up nothing conclusive, just the usual family snapshots and house histories. But the feeling of being watched, of encountering something beyond the ordinary, lingered in the back of my mind. I shared the experience with friends and family, hoping for some rational explanation or comfort. Most dismissed it as a case of mistaken identity or a product of a restless mind. But the memory of the encounter, the feeling of bumping into someone who wasn't there, and my boyfriend's description of the figure in the white dress stayed with me. From that day on, I couldn't walk past that hallway or glance at the upstairs window without a shiver of unease. The house, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now seemed to hold secrets and shadows that I couldn't quite understand. The memory of that night, of the woman in white and the inexplicable encounter, became a part of my life's story, a haunting reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown, between reality and the realm of the supernatural. This chilling interaction. After my father passed away, I returned home to visit my mother, who had been struggling to cope with the loss. The house, once bustling with the familiar noise of our daily lives, now seemed eerily silent, the echoes of laughter and conversation replaced by a heavy, oppressive quiet. I was alone in the house, with only the weight of grief and the solitude of my own thoughts for company. The first night back was the hardest. I had hoped that returning to the place where I had spent so many of my formative years would bring some comfort, some semblance of normalcy. But instead, the house felt cold and hollow, as though it was mourning the absence of its former inhabitants. The silence was palpable, wrapping around me like a shroud, and every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind outside seemed magnified, resonating with an unsettling intensity. That evening, after a long day of sorting through my father's belongings and trying to piece together fragments of a life now gone, I sat in the living room, lost in thought. I had settled into the familiar couch, the cushions worn from years of use, and tried to find solace in the comforting routine of flipping through old family photo albums. The photos, though bittersweet, brought back memories of happier times, of laughter and love, shared under this very roof. It was then, as I was engrossed in a particularly old photograph, that I heard it, a noise from upstairs. It was faint at first, just a subtle sound that might have been easily mistaken for the house settling or the distant hum of the heating system. But then it grew clearer, more distinct, a sound that, despite its ghostly quality, was unmistakable. I heard the unmistakable creak of a computer chair moving, followed by the soft, deliberate thud of footsteps on the floor. The sound was so vivid and familiar that I could almost picture my father's daily routine, his footsteps echoing through the house as he moved from his study to the living room and back. The noise was coming from his room, the room where he had spent countless hours working on his computer, lost in his own world. My heart raced as I listened, the sound growing louder and more distinct. The footsteps approached the door of his room, and I could almost see the door handle turning, the slow creak of the hinges as it swung open. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed with a mix of anticipation and dread. The footsteps continued down the stairs, each step resonating with an almost eerie clarity. I could hear the sound of the footsteps as they descended, the rhythm so familiar, so ingrained in my memory. As the footsteps reached the last step, I could almost feel the presence of my father, standing there, a ghostly echo of the man I had known. For a few moments there was an unsettling stillness, a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the footsteps began their ascent once more. They climbed back up the stairs, the sound of each step growing fainter until the door to my father's room closed with a soft but definitive click. I sat there, paralyzed, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just experienced. I was only a few feet away in the living room, the distance between us a mere handful of steps. The sensation of my father moving through the house, of hearing his footsteps so clearly, was both comforting and terrifying. It was as though he was trying to communicate, to let me know that he was still here, still a part of this place that had been his home for so many years. But the reality of the situation was too overwhelming. I was alone, and yet I had felt the unmistakable presence of someone who was no longer there. The chilling interaction had left me shaken, my mind grappling with the reality of loss and the inexplicable feeling of being close to someone who had passed beyond the veil of life. The experience haunted me throughout the night, each creak of the house and every whisper of wind outside serving as a reminder of that eerie encounter. I tried to convince myself that it was simply my mind playing tricks on me, that the sounds I heard were just echoes of memories and the echoes of a grief-stricken mind. But deep down, I knew that what I had experienced was something far more profound, a haunting reminder of the connection that transcends life and death. The following days were spent in a haze of contemplation and reflection, trying to come to terms with the experience and find meaning in the encounter. I spoke to others who had experienced similar phenomena, hoping to find some comfort or explanation. And while the rational part of me struggled to make sense of the encounter, the emotional part found solace in the idea that my father's presence, though no longer tangible, was still a part of the home we had shared. In the end, the chilling interaction became a poignant reminder of the bond that exists beyond the physical world, a reminder that love and memory persist even when the person we once knew is no longer there. And though the experience left me with a lingering sense of unease, it also brought a measure of comfort, a reminder that, in some way, my father was still watching over me, still a part of the home and the memories we had built together. This familiar happening. A few years ago, I decided to visit a close friend who lived in a cozy townhouse on the edge of town. It had been a while since we'd last seen each other, and I was looking forward to catching up and spending some quality time together. My friend, Emily, had a charming place with a warm, inviting atmosphere that felt like a home away from home. Emily's townhouse was well-loved and had its own unique character, with a mix of eclectic decor and personal touches. She had a roommate who was away for the weekend, so I was given the option to sleep in the roommate's room, which was located in the basement. The basement was furnished with a comfortable bed, and despite its location, it felt cozy and private. That night, after a long day of reminiscing and catching up, I went to bed in the basement, looking forward to a good night's sleep. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that blankets you in a sense of peaceful solitude. I drifted off quickly, the comfort of the bed and the soft hum of the house's ventilation system creating a soothing lullaby. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by a gentle sensation, a feeling of being covered up more securely. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw a figure standing beside the bed. It was a man dressed in a black suit and a black hat, the kind that resembled a classic fedora. The figure was methodically adjusting the covers over me, his actions gentle and deliberate. The contrast of his dark attire against the soft glow of the nightlight created an almost surreal scene. Surprisingly, I felt no fear. The man's presence, though unexpected, was calm and unthreatening. There was something soothing about his actions, as if he was there to offer comfort rather than cause distress. After he finished tucking me in, he turned and walked towards the basement's sliding glass door. The door, which led out to a small patio area in the backyard, slid open with a soft whoosh, and the figure stepped outside into the night. I watched him disappear through the door, but instead of feeling alarmed, I simply turned over and fell back to sleep, the encounter fading from my thoughts as I drifted off again. The entire incident was so serene that it left no lasting impression of fear or unease. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Emily's roommate returning. After exchanging pleasantries and catching up, I mentioned the peculiar experience I had during the night. I described the man in the black suit and hat and how he had gently covered me up before walking out through the sliding glass door. Emily's roommate, her eyes widening slightly, looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Oh," she said, her tone casual yet filled with an undertone of intrigue. "So you saw our ghost too?" I was taken aback by her response. "Our ghost?" I repeated, my curiosity piqued. "Yes," she explained. "We've had that same figure appear before. He's always dressed the same way, and he seems to have this habit of covering people up and then leaving through the sliding door. It's a bit of a mystery around here. Most people who see him say he's very calm and friendly, just like you described." The revelation left me with a mix of disbelief and fascination. I hadn't expected to encounter a ghost, let alone one that seemed so benign and considerate. Emily's roommate shared that the ghost had been a part of their home for as long as she could remember, a presence that had never caused any harm and was often seen as a protective figure rather than a malevolent one. As we continued our conversation, Emily joined in, confirming that she had heard similar stories from other guests and had experienced some odd occurrences herself. The ghostly presence, it seemed, was a well-known part of the house's lore, adding an unexpected layer of mystery to the home's charm. Reflecting on the experience, I felt a sense of wonder rather than fear. The encounter with the man in the black suit had been so gentle and unobtrusive that it seemed to embody the idea of a guardian spirit rather than something to be feared. It was as if the ghost was a comforting presence, a reminder of the continuity of care and kindness beyond the physical realm. The visit to Emily's townhouse became an unforgettable part of my memories, a story I often shared with friends and family. It was a reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, extraordinary experiences can occur, leaving us with stories that challenge our understanding of the world and its mysteries. This missing camper. During one of my summer breaks from college, I took a job at an all-girls summer camp nestled in a secluded part of the woods. The camp, surrounded by tall pines and tranquil lakes, was a haven for young girls eager for adventure and camaraderie. My role as a camp counselor included welcoming the new campers, introducing them to the various activities, and ensuring they felt safe and excited about their time at camp. The first day of camp was always a whirlwind of activity. Parents dropped off their daughters, and the air buzzed with the energy of excited chatter and the clatter of luggage being hauled to the cabins. Once the parents had left, it was our job to settle the girls in, give them a tour of the camp, and lay down some ground rules. One of the rules that we emphasized during the tour was that no one was allowed to enter cabin 5. We'd been instructed by the camp directors to maintain this policy strictly, but no one had given us a clear explanation for the restriction beyond vague references to tradition and camp lore. As we pointed out cabin 5 to the new campers, warning them not to go near it, I remember the collective curiosity of the girls as they peered at the old wooden structure. It was a quaint rustic building, painted a faded green that seemed to blend into the surrounding forest. The windows were framed with peeling white paint, and the door was a weathered slab of wood that looked as though it had seen better days. From where we stood, we could see into the cabin through the window. To our surprise, a little girl in a white dress was sitting on one of the beds, her back turned to us. The sight was unsettling, especially since the cabin had been closed off and we had not been expecting anyone in there. The girl appeared to be about 8 or 9 years old, with long hair cascading down her back. Her dress, though old-fashioned, looked pristine, as if it had been freshly pressed. My initial reaction was to assume that a camper had somehow sneaked in, despite the cabin being locked and off-limits. I exchanged a look with another counselor, Sarah, and we both decided to investigate and gently escort the girl back to the group. As we walked toward cabin 5, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path, I felt a growing sense of unease. The once familiar cabin now seemed to exude an air of foreboding, its shadows deepening as the sun began to set. The sounds of the camp's other activities faded into the background, replaced by the eerie silence that seemed to envelop cabin 5. When we reached the door, I tried the handle, but it was locked. I knocked firmly and called out, but there was no response. With a sense of growing anxiety, Sarah and I decided to use our spare key to unlock the door. When the door creaked open, we stepped inside, our flashlights casting long, wavering beams across the dusty interior. The cabin was empty. The beds were neatly made, the room was devoid of any signs of recent activity, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and mustiness. We checked every corner, but there was no sign of the little girl we had seen through the window. As we stood in the middle of the room, bewildered and slightly shaken, I remembered the camp's unsettling rumors about cabin 5. I had heard whispers from other counselors and staff about a ghostly presence that haunted the cabin, but I had always dismissed them as mere campfire stories meant to spook newcomers. It wasn't until this moment that I began to question the validity of those tales. The story, as I later learned from some of the longtime staff, was that the cabin was haunted by the spirit of a little girl who had tragically died in the 1970s. According to the legend, she had fallen off a horse and been stepped on, her life cut short in a tragic accident. The camp had chosen to keep cabin 5 closed to honor her memory and avoid disturbing her spirit. That evening, as we gathered around the campfire, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The girls were buzzing with excitement, sharing their own spooky stories and playing games, but I found it hard to concentrate. The vision of the girl in the white dress and the empty cabin replayed in my mind, and a shiver ran down my spine each time I thought about it. In the days that followed, the story of what I had seen became a topic of conversation among the counselors and campers. The new campers were intrigued by the ghost story, and it quickly became one of the most talked about legends of the camp. While some took it in stride, others were visibly spooked by the idea of encountering the ghost of Cabin 5. For me, the experience was a profound reminder of how the unknown can sometimes bridge the gap between reality and the supernatural. The image of the little girl in the white dress remained etched in my memory, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that linger just beyond our understanding. As the summer camp session continued, I often found myself glancing nervously at Cabin 5 whenever I passed by. The stories of the little girl, combined with my own eerie encounter, made the cabin a place of fascination and fear. And though I continued to work at the camp and enjoyed many more summers there, the memory of that haunting encounter never truly faded, leaving me with a lingering sense of awe and apprehension whenever I thought about that fateful night. And this eerie man. When I was a child, our home was a typical suburban house with an old-world charm. I remember spending hours playing in the living room, my toys scattered around as I built imaginary worlds with blocks and action figures. One day, while engrossed in my game, I felt an inexplicable urge to look over my shoulder. It was as if some unseen force was compelling me to turn around. When I did, I saw something that made my heart race with fear. Stepping out from the shadows of my closet was a figure dressed in a dark suit. The man's appearance was striking and unsettling. His suit was impeccably tailored, yet his face was obscured, almost like a shadow against the dim light of my room. He had a somber, unreadable expression, and his presence seemed to chill the very air around him. I stared in disbelief for a moment before my instincts kicked in, and I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I told my parents about the strange man, but they brushed it off as a figment of my imagination, perhaps a product of my overactive childhood fears. They assured me that there was nothing to worry about, and soon I put the incident out of my mind. The man in the suit became a fleeting memory, buried under the weight of growing up and the mundane details of everyday life. Years later, I was a teenager, and my family had moved to a new house. It was a warm summer night, and I had gone to bed with the windows open, enjoying the cool breeze that filtered through the curtains. I was deep asleep when a feeling of dread jolted me awake. My room was pitch dark, and I felt an inexplicable chill. My eyes shot open, and to my horror, there he was again, the man in the suit. He stood at the edge of my bed, his figure just as shadowy and indistinct as I remembered from my childhood. His presence felt oppressive, and I was paralyzed by a wave of fear. My mind raced, and I quickly decided that I needed to get away. I scrambled out of bed and ran to my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed the door shut behind me. It was an odd decision, as I never slept with my door closed. It was always left slightly ajar for comfort. But that night, I felt an overwhelming urge to shut it. In the hours that followed, I was restless, tossing and turning as the fear from the encounter lingered in my mind. Just as I began to drift back to sleep, a sudden, piercing sound jolted me awake, the smoke alarm blaring with an intensity that cut through the darkness. I shot out of bed, adrenaline surging through my veins, and dashed to the door. Peering through the crack, I was met with an alarming sight, smoke billowing through the hallway. The living room was engulfed in flames, the fire spreading rapidly through the house. My heart raced as I realized the gravity of the situation. I had to act fast. I remembered the window in my room, and I hurriedly opened it, pushing aside the curtains and climbing out to safety. Once outside, I watched in disbelief as the fire consumed our home. The blaze was fierce and unforgiving, devouring everything in its path. Firefighters arrived quickly, but the damage was extensive. The house was lost, reduced to smoldering ruins. In the aftermath, as I stood amidst the debris, the gravity of what had happened began to sink in. The firefighters later told me that if I hadn't closed my bedroom door, the smoke would have filled the room, likely causing me to succumb to smoke inhalation before I could escape. They marveled at how the door had contained the smoke, buying me the precious time I needed to get out. I couldn't shake the eerie coincidence of the events. The man in the suit, who had frightened me so deeply years before, seemed to have played a role in saving my life. Whether he was a guardian angel, a supernatural entity, or simply a figment of my imagination, I couldn't say for certain. But I couldn't ignore the connection between his presence and the fortuitous timing of the fire. Since then, the man in the suit has remained a haunting presence in my memories. I've often wondered about his true nature and why he appeared in my life at those pivotal moments. I still find myself looking over my shoulder from time to time, half expecting to see that familiar shadowy figure. As unsettling as the experience was, it brought me a sense of gratitude. The chilling encounter with the man in the suit, paired with the harrowing night of the fire, made me appreciate the inexplicable ways in which our lives can be shaped by forces beyond our understanding. Have you ever had a ghostly encounter that left you stunned, whether it was a chilling apparition or an unexplained phenomenon? We want to hear your stories. Share your wildest or scariest real-life ghost experiences in the comments below. Your tale could be the next one to send shivers down our spine. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.